morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. You know, we have produced almost 150 live streams since we went virtual last March 2020, and all of our live streams are available for viewing on our website. Remember, you can go visit our new website at lawacth.org to register for programs, view past programs, renew your membership, and make a donation. For those of you who are not yet members of the Council Town Hall, an individual membership is only $100 a year, about $8 a month. And it has so many other benefits with our travel program, our exclusive film program, and other special member-only events. So please check it out on our website to see all of the various benefits. We really depend on your support to keep us going. Thank you so much. I know all of you know the drill with the question and answer process with Dan, but just in case we have some new viewers on, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on our own Professor Dan Schnur and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus.
Hello, Kim.
It's so good to have you back. Given the news cycle, Dan, it is so challenging for you and the team to figure out how to narrow down the topics to 3 each week, let alone cover it in an hour.
Well, the team deserves a great deal of credit. As I've told our group before, Jessica and Claire both are absolutely phenomenal. And yesterday, when the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear the Mississippi case on abortion rights, they decided to add that as a topic and to reshuffle our lineup for the week because we wanted to be on top of breaking news. And so it should be a fascinating conversation and one that no doubt we'll revisit down the line as well, but we wanted to be right on top of it this week.
Absolutely. So without further ado, let me run through those topics that we finally decided on just not too many hours ago. Number 1, the future of Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court takes on abortion. Number 2, how much should we worry about inflation? And 3, what to do about China, Biden's biggest foreign policy challenge. Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. And thanks as always to all of you for joining us for these conversations. We really enjoy them, and I hope that last week's shift to Wednesday wasn't too much of a disruption for all of you. But as I mentioned to you then, my class final at Berkeley was on Tuesday. And I think the students would have been somewhat upset if I hadn't shown up for it. So I appreciate your flexibility. But let's start out by talking about the Supreme Court. And in just a minute, we're going to look at the court's decision to consider the Mississippi case. We're going to talk about it in 3 different ways today. We're going to talk about the public opinion landscape as it relates to the issue of abortion. We're going to talk about the case itself. And then finally, we're going to talk about possible next steps as this landmark case moves forward. But before we do, just by way of grounding and beginning our conversation, we'd like to ask a first question of you as far as your own beliefs on this critically important issue. So Claire, well, there you go. Thank you very much. First topic, or first question, how would you describe your own position on the issue of abortion? Number 1, I support legal abortions under most or all circumstances. Number 2, I personally oppose abortion, but I believe it should remain legal. And as you can see, that got cut off a little bit there, but the second option is that while you oppose abortion, you believe it should stay legal. Third, you'd like to see abortion remain legal, but with more restrictions. That's what the RE is in for. So still legal, but reining in the opportunities to some degree. Third or fourth, I'm opposed to legal abortion, except in cases of rape and incest and when the mother's life is in danger. And finally, I'm opposed to legal abortion under all circumstances. So just as a starting point, let's see where our group comes down on this issue. Not surprisingly, we know based here in Los Angeles, and we know from other conversations we've had with our group over the last year or so, that we do tend to be a pretty blue gathering. And no fewer than 82%, more than 8 in 10 of you, support legal abortions under most or all circumstances. And another 8% who personally oppose abortion want to see it remain legal. So 90% of our group would like to see Roe versus Wade upheld. And I guess what I'd like to do to begin this conversation is talk about the broader landscape of public opinion. And what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is cite some Gallup polling, because it's really easy for those of us who live in very democratic territories, in very urban territories, in big cities, in their suburbs, to assume that everyone shares our opinion on this issue. But let me use some polling just to give you some grounding on what the national feelings on abortion are. So we're going to rely on the Gallup poll, which I think all of you would agree, which I hope all of you would agree is really the gold standard of policy and issue-based polling in this country. And they ask questions on this topic every year. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, they asked the question for their 2020 poll, simply if the respondents consider themselves to be pro-choice or pro-life. And the response, and this might surprise some of you, I have to admit it was a little bit surprising to me, is when asked the question, self-describing yourself as pro-choice or pro-life, the numbers were 48% who said they were pro-choice and 46% who said they were pro-life. 48 to 46, only a 2-point difference, which is within most polls' margin of error. Last year, just to give you some sense that the margin of error does allow for some imprecision, last year 46% said they were pro-choice and 49 said they were pro-life. In 2018, it was an absolute tie, 48 to 48%. Now, to give you some historical perspective, if you go back into the late 20th century, in 1995, Gallup found that 56% of respondents said they were pro-choice. Only 33 said they were pro-life. That was in 1995. And then in the early 2000s, we saw that the numbers were beginning to close just a little bit. In 2006, during the middle of George W. Bush's second term as president, the numbers were 51 pro-choice and 41 pro-life. Since then, for the last 15 years, the margins have been within 10 points. Now, let's agree that the terms pro-choice and pro-life are somewhat imprecise. And Gallup did some additional polling too. So before we get to this upcoming case, I'm going to share some other numbers with you. The Gallup poll also asks every year a more specific question. Do you think abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances, like we just asked you, or under few circumstances or no circumstances? So a very binary choice here, all versus most circumstances versus few or none. This May, the poll that came out a week or two ago showed that 43% of Americans felt that abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances. 43%. 55% said that it should be legal under few circumstances or absolutely none. 2 years ago, in 2018, the numbers were fairly similar. 43% said legal under all or most circumstances, 53% under few or none. And you have to go back into the 1990s to find a relatively even balance on this question. In 1994, 46% of respondents told Gallup that they wanted abortion to be legal under all or most circumstances. And 51% said under few or none. Now, forcing a binary choice is not ideal either, so I'm going to share with you one more poll question that Gallup's been asking every year for 25 years or so now. And the way they frame this question is to offer a middle ground. And this time, on this question, they said, Should abortion be legal under any circumstance, under certain circumstance, or under no circumstance? So it allowed their respondents to choose a middle option rather than abortion being legal all the time or none of the time. Well, in this month's poll, 50% chose that middle option, exactly half. 29% said abortion should be legal under any circumstances. 20% said under no circumstances at all. And once again, these numbers reflect what we've seen for many years now. 2 years ago, these numbers were almost identical. 29% said abortion should be legal under any and all circumstances, 18% under none. And once again, 50% said half. And then once again, you need to go back to the 1990s to see a little bit less of a skew on this issue, when 31% of Americans said that abortion should be legal under any circumstances, and only 12% said none. So over the course of a quarter of a century, for all sorts of reasons, and maybe it's something we can go into the future, American public opinion has shifted on this issue. And so when we watch the debates taking place in Washington and during election years, knowing that the American public is so divided on this issue might help us gain some perspective from where we sit. Anyway, so let's go on to the case itself. So here we are. It's almost 7 months after Amy Coney Barrett was sworn in as a Supreme Court justice, and the court has decided to take a case that could redefine abortion law in the United States. The court announced yesterday that it's going to review a very restrictive Mississippi abortion law, which would ban almost all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The law hasn't gone into effect due to lower court rulings that say it would go against decades of Supreme Court precedent, including Roe versus Wade. And it's important to know, because this is a critical distinction, Mississippi isn't asking the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. A decision in the state's favor would be seen as a huge step toward weakening the abortion protections that Roe v. Wade provides. So when it agreed to review the case, the Supreme Court said it would address one single question: whether all pre-viability prohibitions on elective abortions are unconstitutional. So the question they'll be considering is whether all pre-viability prohibitions on elective abortions are unconstitutional. And let's break down that language just a little bit. So in Roe versus Wade, of course, the court first recognized the right to abortion as a fundamental liberty. Before Roe, states could decide for themselves whether to criminalize abortion, and many at the time of the ruling permitted abortion only when necessary to save the mother's life. Now, Roe versus Wade said that states couldn't restrict abortions during a pregnancy's first trimester, so they set out a very specific timeline. And they said for the first 3 months of a pregnancy, no abortion restrictions are allowed. Now, almost 20 years after that, in 1992, the court reaffirmed that core of Roe versus Wade in the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But in this case, the freedom to have an abortion was no longer pegged to a specific time frame regarding trimesters, but rather to a more general threshold of what was called fetal viability, which the court then estimated at being around 24 to 28 weeks into pregnancy. So the term viability is a much more vague one, and this is where the Mississippi law comes from. Today, it's generally accepted that viability occurs at about the 22nd or 23rd week of pregnancy, and the Mississippi law unquestionably prohibits abortions before viability, arguing that it is an unduly vague standard. In its appeal, Mississippi argued that viability is, I'm quoting from their appeal, Mississippi argued that viability is, quote, not an appropriate standard for assessing the constitutionality of a law regarding abortion, unquote. They believe it's too subjective. And the state says its ban was designed to protect the health of the mother as well as the life of the fetus. Now, there's some background there, and we're going to talk about next steps in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to pause, and Claire, maybe if you can put up the second question, is given the background that I've provided on the case, and hopefully some additional understanding of it, my question for you is, how do you feel about the court's decision to hear the case? One, I'm worried that the court will outlaw legal abortions altogether. Two, I'm worried that abortions will become much more difficult. And this is an important distinction. Third, I believe that the court's decision to accept the case does reflect I'm sorry. I believe that the court's decision to accept the case does not necessarily mean that the law is going to be changed. In other words, they could decide to reject the Mississippi case. And I apologize for the cutoff there. Fourth, third, once again, the third option is you believe that the court's decision to accept the case does not necessarily mean that the Mississippi challenge will be upheld. Fourth, I'm very hopeful that the court will outlaw legal abortions. And fifth, I'm hopeful that abortions will become much more difficult to achieve legally in this country. Now, we have a pretty strong pro-choice group, as we established earlier. So let's hear what our thoughts are on this issue. And once again, I apologize for the confusion on the question. Okay. Once again, not surprising at all, given what we saw in the previous question. If you add up those first two answers, 83% of our group is worried that the court will either outlaw legal abortions or make them much more difficult. And the 55% of you who said that you were worried that the abortions would become much more difficult are probably on slightly better standing, because while the court could use this as an opportunity to revoke Roe versus Wade altogether, what's much more likely, in order to, at least to some degree, to respect the precedent, is they would see the Mississippi case as further restricting abortion rights rather than eliminating them altogether. So let's talk about what comes next. This case is going to be heard in the court's next term, beginning in October, and then we'll have a decision, in all likelihood, sometime next spring or early summer, which of course is just in time for the midterm elections. Now, in the past, Chief Justice Roberts has been the swing vote on other key cases, such as the Affordable Care Act and last year's case referencing abortion clinic access in Louisiana. And Roberts, while identified as pro-life through many other means, has sided with the then liberal justices, primarily, we assume, because of what he believes should be the apolitical nature of the court. But Roberts's decisions on the Louisiana case and on the Affordable Care Act, that was when the court was 5-4. And after Justice Ginsburg's passing and Justice Comey's confirmation, this court is now solidly conservative, 6-3. And so Roberts is no longer a swing vote. And even if he decided to vote against the Mississippi appeal, that's still more likely than not 5 votes to uphold the Mississippi law. Now, to be clear, we don't know yet how the Trump-appointed justices view Roe versus Wade. Neil Gorsuch, during his confirmation hearing, noted that it was a precedent that has repeatedly been affirmed. And Gorsuch said the following. He said, quote, "A good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court, worthy of treatment as precedent like any other." So it sounds like he's respecting precedent, but of course that's not a promise not to overturn Roe v. Wade. Brett Kavanaugh, for his part, when he was working as a White House lawyer during the Bush administration, advised against calling Roe versus Wade settled law. But during his confirmation hearing 3 years ago, he called it precedent upon precedent, which implies at least that he would be inclined to respect it. But once again, we don't know. And Amy Coney Barrett of the three has been the most forthcoming, but she seemed to say during her own confirmation hearing that she does not consider the case to be super precedent that cannot be overturned. She was very forthright about her pro-life beliefs, and many expect her to be the lead voice in this case. Now, if the court ruled to uphold the Mississippi law, it's estimated that 24 states would see access to abortion dramatically limited. But of course, the courts are only one of three branches of government. Some of you may remember that Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said that while she strongly agreed with Roe, she believed that the court intervened prematurely back in 1973, and that Congress should have addressed the issue before the court did. And it is worth pointing out that if there's an issue that the Democrats would be willing to blow up the filibuster over, it's probably abortion. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the court either strikes down or dramatically curtails Roe next summer. A Nancy Pelosi-run House of Representatives, just a few months before the midterm elections, could very easily pass a bill legalizing abortion. The Senate, of course, is divided 50-50, at least we presume it will be then. And in the face of what might be united GOP opposition, although we don't know how Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski could vote on this. But even with a 50-50 tie, the Democratic Senate could decide to either permanently or more likely temporarily suspend the filibuster, pass the abortion bill, and then Biden changes it into law. Now, given the poll numbers I talked about at the beginning of this very long segment, there's no guarantee that any of that happens. But while it'll be several months before the court hears the case and several months after that before it acts, I think it is worth remembering that a Democratic Congress and Democratic president, at least theoretically, have it in their power to pass a law that the court would be in a much weaker position to overturn. Let's move on to topic number 2. And we're going to talk for just a few minutes about inflation. I spent a little bit more time on this Mississippi abortion case than I intended to, but I think you'd all agree that the import of Roe versus Wade is sufficiently strong that it was worth digging into a little bit more deeply. Let's talk a little bit about inflation, because of course that's a pretty big deal too. Okay, last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the consumer price index was 4.2% higher in April than it had been a year earlier. The day after that, the Bureau reported that the producer price index had gone up 6.2% from the previous year. Now, just because those numbers sound a little bit abstract, what I will tell you is that's the fastest price growth. In other words, the fastest rise in inflation in more than a decade. And these developments have followed a series of high-profile warnings, including some of Biden's supporters, that Biden's very ambitious spending plans, plus the Federal Reserve's commitment to keeping interest rates low, could lead to overheating and to inflation. Now, this country has not experienced serious inflation since the late 1970s or early 1980s, so it's been a while. The big question now is whether these current price increases are temporary, or are they warning signs of more serious problems ahead? Now, some of these price increases are due to unique circumstances. For example, the price of new cars are up. But that's mainly because there's been a shortage of computer chips that we now use for many of the car's core systems. And so that hopefully is a temporary phenomenon. The prices of new cars are not going up because of inflationary pressures, but rather because of shortage of a very specific type of supply. Gasoline prices are going up, and to a large degree, although not entirely, that's a result of the pipeline crisis we saw last week on the East Coast. Travel prices, airfare and hotel prices are going up, but a lot of analysts think that that's mainly a result of a post-COVID surge that once again is temporary. But areas where inflation could become much more of a problem are areas like the service industry, particularly restaurants, and food costs. And food costs are probably the greatest indicator of inflationary panic because working class and lower class Americans are those who are hit most harshly by rising food prices. and we are seeing a significant spike there right now. Once again, we don't know whether this is a temporary blip or whether it's the sign of a bigger problem to come. One possibility is that the economy and the US workforce after the pandemic are experiencing just sort of the normal ups and downs that come through the economic recovery. The other possibility, though, is that the pandemic caused economic shocks, which may have set off deep-seated inflationary forces. And that's much more serious because for political reasons that we talked about last week, that's going to put pressure on Biden to cut back on his spending plans for both his physical infrastructure and his social infrastructure bills. Even though unemployment's still high and you still have many, many businesses struggling to survive. Well, let me ask you this. Given all those sort of mind-numbing numbers, how big a threat do you think inflation is to our recovery? Is the threat very big? We should be worrying about increased government spending, and maybe Biden should cut back on his next legislative goals. Second, it's somewhat of a threat, but government needs to keep spending in order to boost the economy until we're back to full employment. Third, it's a small threat. But let's keep an eye on inflation, but let's not overreact. We're still on our way out of recession, and we can, we don't need to overreact to this. Or fourth, inflation is not a threat at all. Full speed ahead. The president should go ahead with his spending plans because ultimately that's the way to get the economy moving again. And what do we think is our answer for that? Oh, this is very interesting. 19%, almost 1 in 5 of you are very concerned about inflation. And that should be a warning sign to President Biden that 20% of you feel that increased government spending could be a potential problem. The overwhelming majority, almost 80% of you, come there somewhere in between. It's somewhat of a threat or a small threat, but we probably need to keep spending in order to come out of the recession. And then 3% say let's no hesitation at all. And if I'm Joe Biden, I look at that 3% number and I'm worried that it's not bigger. Because if Biden is going to move forward on his infrastructure legislation, it goes without saying that he needs the support of the overwhelming majority of his base. And 3% saying full speed ahead is not an encouraging sign for him. Because the politics get pretty complicated for Biden. Why? Because there are basic laws of supply and demand. When people don't have enough money to purchase available goods, prices go down. When people have more money than is normally needed to purchase those goods, prices go up. And some of Biden's critics are suggesting that continued unemployment benefits are driving the price increases because more people have more money at hand. Biden argues that the employment weaknesses that we saw in last month's jobs report means that his spending packages are more needed than ever. But Republicans and a lot of business leaders are saying that increased government spending, including those enhanced unemployment benefits, might discourage economic growth. And that argument, as we talked about last week, is gradually gaining salience in the public debate, as we've seen not just in broader public opinion polls, but in our own surveys. Now, 2 key indicators to watch over the next few weeks as it relates to inflation. The first will be next month's job numbers, because if job growth continues as it was for the first few months of the year, then we know that the April numbers were just an aberration. And in fact, the US economy is still on path to economic recovery. Alternatively, if the job creation numbers stay low and we don't see higher numbers in May than we saw in April, then that means that we're probably seeing a trend, which means that inflation is going to be a bigger threat, and the likelihood of Biden needing to cut back on his spending programs is going to increase. So that's one indicator to watch, next month's job numbers. The other thing to watch is about a dozen states, not surprisingly all run by Republican governors, about a dozen states have now begun reducing unemployment benefits in order to encourage workers to take jobs. Because they argue that the unemployment benefits are creating a disincentive for people to go back to work. So what many of these states are doing instead is, instead of just continuing unemployment payments, are offering what they call an employment bonus. So someone who goes back into the workforce gets an added sum from the state government for it. So what we're going to see is about a quarter of the states in the country are now embarking on an experiment to see if the unemployment benefits are what's causing the underwhelming job numbers and the concerns about inflation. And over the next few months, if we see those dozen or so states beginning to move back closer toward fuller employment, then that too is going to increase pressure on Biden and on Congress to make similar decisions on unemployment benefits at the federal level. So as I think you've gathered by now, unfortunately, the more detailed conversation about the Roe versus Wade case that's come before the US Supreme Court, the extended conversation we had once again precluded us from talking about China the way I'd hoped to. So Jessica, I think we're going to have to put off China once again until next week. And in the meantime, though, if you're willing to join me, maybe we can begin to answer some of our group's questions, both about the two topics that we did discuss and anything else that's on their mind.
Sounds good. Thank you. And yes, we will bring China back next week. So to our audience members, we'll make that the first topic next week, maybe instead of the third.
Good idea.
The first question, what explains a significant decline in the percentage of people who say they are pro-choice over the past 20 years, given the apparently changing age and other demographic shifts? The recent numbers seem very counterintuitive.
Well, the numbers do seem counterintuitive, because I think when you live in an environment like many of us do, or in a community like many of us do, with very strong feelings on one side of an issue, it's human nature to assume that those in our surrounding community reflect broader public opinion. And at least on this issue, that's not the case. I think a couple of things have happened here. What pro-life advocates argue is that increasing technological sophistication, advances in technology, allowing people to see the fetus in a way that they weren't able to 20, 25, 30 years ago, has, again, in the argument of the pro-life community, have humanized that fetus. And it has made people more reluctant to support abortion rights when they are able to see when they are able to see that fetus in the mother's womb. The other thing is worth noting is, just like gun purchases go up when a Democrat gets elected president, what we generally see is some shift in these pro-choice, pro-life numbers, depending on the outcome of the most recent election. And it sounds a little bit odd, but when a pro-life Republican is elected president, you see the number of people who call themselves pro-life go down a little bit. And when a pro-choice Democrat gets elected president, you see the pro-choice numbers go down. And I think, because it really is only along the margins, my own suspicion is that's based less on strong, heartfelt beliefs about whether abortion should be legal or not, but at least for those middle-of-the-road, more centrist voters, it's a natural suspicion toward government. And if they do think a president is going to act too aggressively in one direction or the other, then at least a few percent line up more on the other side. But I do believe that there is something to be said for the argument about technology. And as I said earlier, this is an issue outside the context of the Mississippi case that we should probably come back to at some point in the future and dig into deeply, not just as it relates to the Supreme Court, but as it relates to society's feelings on such an important issue.
Are most restrictions on abortion rights based on religion, societal values, political beliefs, or all three?
Well, I think the easiest and best answer is probably D, all of the above. That said, most Americans who self-identify as pro-life generally tend to also identify as more religious. And we've talked about this before in the webinar under other contexts. The single most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior is no longer income like it was through most of the 20th century. The single most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior, as some of you may have heard me say before, is what the political scientists call religiosity, the frequency with which an individual attends religious services. And as the American public has become more and more divided on social and cultural issues, as opposed to economic matters, then I do believe that those religious sentiments are certainly not the sole driver, but the main driver of that split. And the reason I said D, all of the above, is because those religious beliefs more and more drive a voter's political leanings to a much greater degree than they have in the past.
Do we have more data behind Gallup results, whether it's women versus men and preferences by age?
Okay. We do. And I don't have those numbers at hand, but what I can tell you from memory are two things. Number one, not surprisingly, women tend to be more pro-choice than men. Men tend to be more pro-life. And I am the second most qualified person on this screen to offer a supposition as to why that is, but I think it's for understandable reasons. And then for age, this is really interesting. On most social and cultural issues, you see younger people differing dramatically from their parents and grandparents. For example, on issues relating to same-sex marriage and marriage equality, you tend to see Gen Z and millennials, even self-described conservatives among those generations, who are much more likely to support same-sex marriage than older generations are. On abortion, we really don't see much of a shift as we go through the generations. That young people, age 18 to 29, don't come down in a much different way than older voters do. So that there is a notable gender gap, but generationally these numbers have remained very, very static.
Does California have enough abortion supporters to keep its current abortion laws, or will the overturn of Roe versus Wade affect the state?
The common supposition, as I said earlier, is that there are 24 states that would either see abortion outlawed should Roe versus Wade be overturned, or more likely, 24 states that would see abortion access much more seriously limited as a result of the Supreme Court acting in support of the Mississippi law. California is one of the bluer states in the country. I think is fairly unlikely to see that kind of shift. I think 24 states, roughly half, would head in the other direction. I think California would probably not. But that said, California would probably need to find ways to support abortion rights and abortion procedures in the absence of a federal policy. So I don't think there would be any threat to the legal ability of a woman to achieve an abortion here in California, but that doesn't mean that the state would be completely unaffected by a U.S. Supreme Court decision.
Does the court have the option to decide to decline to hear the Mississippi case when the session actually begins in October?
Okay. They could. It's worth noting that it takes 4 justices, not a majority, to agree to hear a case. And there have been any number of occasions in the past on this issue and others where a minority of the justices decided to hear a case but weren't able to convince a 5th justice to go along with them. So at least theoretically, we don't know how many of the justices agreed to hear this case. But if it was just 5, for example, if Roberts would have just as soon avoided it, which would be in keeping with his judicial history, then it's entirely possible that one of those 5 conservative justices could change their mind between now and October. But the court waited an unusually long time to decide to hear this case. It's something they've been arguing about for months now. And the fact that they've argued about it this long makes me think that even though it's generally unlikely that a justice is going to change their mind on whether to hear a case, after this announcement's been made, because it was clearly such a contentious debate among the justices. It's very hard to imagine that any of the five justices would switch. So I think this decision makes it not absolute, but pretty close to impossible for anything to happen later this year, other than for the case to be heard.
Might upholding the 15-week law mean sustainability or viability can be considered 15 weeks by other states?
Well, the trick here or the tricky part here is the Mississippi law is not arguing that 15 weeks is viable. It's arguing, and more broadly, and what the U.S. Supreme Court is considering, is whether all laws restricting abortion before viability are constitutional or not. So I don't know that there's a decision that's a discussion taking place or that will take place when the court hears the case as to whether technology has advanced to a point where 15 weeks can be considered viable. Rather, it's I don't want to say it's a philosophical question, but it's a less chronological question. Not whether 15 weeks is viable or not, but rather a pre-viability abortion should be unconstitutional. Mississippi argues that it should not. We'll see what the U.S. Supreme Court decides.
Could the court decide that a fetus has constitutional protection and thereby outlaw abortions nationwide?
The court could decide that. Historically speaking, they've acted on these types of decisions in a more incremental manner. So it is entirely possible that the U.S. Supreme Court could decide in 2022 to use this case to overturn Roe versus Wade completely. And while that's possible, most court observers who are much smarter on this than me believe it's more likely that they would, if they were to support the Mississippi law, that they would not use an opportunity to overturn Roe v. Wade completely, but rather use this as an additional restriction against access and availability to abortion. One thing that will be important to watch, and we can talk about this in October and probably again next June when the decision comes down, is this puts Chief Justice Roberts in a very interesting position. He might be inclined, as we saw with the Louisiana case last year, he might be inclined to vote against the Mississippi law. But if he votes against it, that means he will not write the opinion. It will fall to the senior justice who voted in favor of the law, and that would be Justice Clarence Thomas. So one of the things for Roberts to decide is, does he vote against the Mississippi law because he thinks it's the wrong thing for the court to be doing? Or does he rather say, since the court would uphold the Mississippi law, regardless of how I, John Roberts, vote, should I vote with the majority in order to write the opinion myself and make it a less all-encompassing and make it a less encompassing decision? And that's we won't know what Roberts' decision is on that for roughly a year, but you could certainly understand the temptation for him to decide to vote for it, even if that wasn't his natural instinct, in order to write a less ambitious decision than perhaps Thomas might.
Due to the shift to the Supreme Court to the far right, shouldn't the Democrats abolish the filibuster and then pass the John Lewis votes right law and then pack the Supreme Court?
Okay, so three different questions there. Number one, should Congress abolish the filibuster? And as I said at the conclusion of my overview of the case, I think that if the court does act the way many expect, that there will be immense pressure on Congress, on the House to pass a bill legalizing abortion, and on the Senate to perhaps not abolish the filibuster, but to suspend it. And I am not smart enough, nor am I able to see the future well enough to know for certain that all 50 Democrats, including Senator Manchin, would vote to suspend the filibuster, but I suspect he might. And I think it's very likely that other more centrist Democratic senators, people like Kristen Sinema, people like Maggie Hassan, people like Mark Warner, even if they have conflicting ideas about whether the filibuster should survive or not, as I said earlier, I can't think of an issue more likely for Democrats to decide to suspend the filibuster than passing a law keeping abortion legal in the United States. As far as expanding the court, I still don't think that that's likely. Biden has, several times expressed his hesitation for it. The commission he set up was specifically designed not just to look at court expansion, but a range of other court reforms. And so I do think that I think suspending the filibuster would be an easier challenge for the Democrats in Congress to achieve than expanding the court. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is a critically important bill. It's one we were going to talk about today until we decided to take on the abortion case. And so all I'll say for right now is that next week, when we do get to voting reform, we'll talk both about the Lewis Act and the broader voting reforms that are being discussed in Congress. So Jessica, I guess we already have two topics for next week, voting reform and China. So tomorrow, all you and Claire and I have to do is come up with a third.
Perfect. Sounds good. I'm going to pivot away from this topic and get to the inflation discussion. If Biden believes that his infrastructure bill will increase employment and generate business revenue, why is he so against deficit spending if the resulting income taxes will pay off the cost of the bill?
I'm not convinced that Biden is as against deficit spending as the administration has made it sound. In fact, I would be very surprised if at least some deficit spending is not part of the ultimate agreement on at least the physical infrastructure bill, on which he does believe that he can find some common ground with Republicans. If Republicans have made it clear that they're not going to revisit the 2017 tax cuts, there's only so much money you can get out of repurposed COVID funds. There's only so much money you can get out of user fees. At a certain point, it's almost going to require deficit spending. And if Biden does want a bipartisan bill, at least for the physical infrastructure legislation, as opposed to what he calls social infrastructure on that second, likely more party line bill, then deficit spending becomes almost unavoidable. And I will bet you that within 30 days, you'll see the administration beginning to let it be known that while it's not their first choice, if it's the only way to get a bipartisan deal, they might be willing to consider it.
Isn't it the more wealthy that are driving prices up, like in housing prices?
Well, I didn't mention housing prices earlier because housing prices have often risen dramatically in the past without causing broader inflation. And there's no question that the competition for higher end housing has intensified over the course of the pandemic. But I don't know whether that's more likely to add to broader inflationary concerns or not. As I said in the past, when housing prices go up, it doesn't necessarily mean that foods and other necessary goods for working class people go up as well. There's an argument to be made that the increased cost of housing means more construction jobs, which means higher salaries for construction workers. And I guess indirectly that could be a contributing factor toward increased inflation. But I do think that food and day-to-day goods and services are probably more likely to impact the broader inflation rate than housing would specifically.
What evidence exists that meager unemployment benefits are discouraging work?
Well, there's an old joke about the one-handed economist, because every economist says on one hand and then on the other. There's immense amounts of evidence on both sides of the debate. We just don't know which one is accurate or not. And that was the point that I was attempting to make earlier, that there's two possibilities for what this price spike is caused by. Number one, is it something temporary taking place as almost growing pains as we come out of a pandemic-driven recession? And if that's the case, it's particularly travel and energy prices that are driving this, and so the inflation will subside. On the other hand, there are people who look at restaurants, who look at other service industries, who look at foods and other durable goods and see that as the signs of more greater likelihood of ongoing inflation. So we simply don't know yet. And to answer the question, there's all sorts of evidence on both sides, but none is conclusive yet. I suspect we'll know a lot more when we see the next set of job numbers in a couple weeks. And from there, if the job numbers are back to where they were in the first few months of the year, then I think the evidence against inflation obviously becomes much stronger.
And a follow on to that, when do enhanced unemployment benefits end under the current stimulus law?
September, at least at the national level. And they were recently extended as part of the COVID relief package. And the dozen states that I mentioned earlier are cutting state level benefits to compensate for the increased federal payments. And again, not all 12 states, but many of them are instead repackaging that money into what they're calling reemployment bonuses. So either way, the individual is compensated in most, though not all of these states. The argument is whether the compensation should continue while they're unemployed, or should be presented to them in one lump sum once they do find a new job.
Is there a general income level where unemployment benefits matter? Maybe 50,000 and less for a family income?
Okay. There is, and I must admit, as I have to from time to time, that I simply don't know what that is. I know that the Biden administration is not providing those $300 a month additional benefits to every American. I don't know off the top of my head what the cutoff for it is.
If currently the major inflation concerns are associated with services to the extent that they are low margin enterprises and labor costs rise, wouldn't we expect the prices in those industries to rise long term because they cannot be absorbed by employers?
Well, we would, and that's exactly what would drive inflation should these concerns turn out to be valid. In other words, if you have more jobs than you have workers, then you have to pay those workers more to take the jobs. And the only way for a business to make ends meet if it's paying its employees more money is to raise prices on its consumers. Once again, we simply don't know yet whether the hesitance of many Americans to return to the workforce is because of the additional unemployment benefits, or is it because concerns about a resurgence of COVID? Is it the fact that schools have not reopened yet, and perhaps we'll see a workforce expansion take place in August when most schools open full time again? Right now, at least, we just don't know.
Okay, pivoting a bit to what's going on in Israel. What will it take to end the current hostilities in Israel? Should the US get more involved?
We saw yesterday Biden for the first time calling for a ceasefire after several days of pressure, not just from other countries, but from any number of members of his own Democratic Party in this country. But it was interesting to note how specific Biden's language was. He didn't say, I want Israel to declare a ceasefire. He simply expressed his support for one. And if that seems like a distinction without a difference, there actually is a pretty important difference there. Because what Biden was essentially doing is saying more passively, I think a ceasefire is a good idea, as opposed to saying more proactively, no Israel, no Netanyahu, you have to impose agree to a ceasefire and you have to do it now. I don't think that the US is going to be able to convince Prime Minister Netanyahu to enact a ceasefire. And I suspect that Netanyahu is not going to agree to one until the Hamas infrastructure in Gaza has been destroyed or sufficiently debilitated to not be a threat in the immediate in the short to medium future. It is worth noting, we'll talk more about this if not next week, in the weeks ahead, that any number of Democrats are now calling for US military aid to Israel to be reviewed before being moved forward, as the Biden administration requested a week or two before the hostilities broke out. Congress acting on that could potentially catch Netanyahu's attention, but because there are not the votes, there's not a two-thirds vote to overrule a Biden veto of stopping U.S. military aid to Israel, even temporarily, the practical impact isn't much. So my best guess is that there will not be a ceasefire until Israel decides that they feel safe enough to agree to one. And I don't know that there is much that Joe Biden can say or do to convince Netanyahu to accelerate that process.
I think we're hosting the French ambassador to the U.S. tomorrow. We're also going to try to get France's perspective on what's going on there too, because it is an international issue, and it can't just be on the U.S. to try to help them reach a resolution.
Well, I would argue, Jessica, and I'll be eager to hear what the ambassador has to say, but everything I've read tells me that the EU is hopelessly deadlocked on Israel, in that its member countries are so divided on whether to put more pressure on Israel or not, that in actuality, there's very little likelihood that the organization does anything. Now, France is among those European countries that has historically put much more pressure on Israel than the US. And when we talk about China next week, one of the topics we'll talk about is that at the same time that that Biden is working so hard to restore the US's relationships with Europe and other historic allies, there's no question that the Israel-Hamas war is putting real strains on that, because countries like France and Germany and other European nations want to see the US engage more forcefully than Biden has to date.
Thank you. Final question. Do you agree with Tom Friedman's editorial in the New York Times that Hamas and Netanyahu are dependent on each other to stay in power? They are codependent.
I don't know if I would use the same language that Friedman does, but as we talked about here last week, it's pretty clear that the domestic political winners of the conflict were Hamas and Netanyahu. Bibi was about to be removed from office. It wasn't guaranteed that the anti-Netanyahu coalition was going to succeed, but Netanyahu had failed to put together a government. And Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett looked very close to putting together a coalition before this violence broke out. Bennett has since pulled out of those negotiations. And so whether Netanyahu intended it or not, there's no question that the violence has benefited him in terms of domestic politics. And by the same token, as we talked about last week, particularly when the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, decided to postpone Palestinian elections yet again recently, Hamas saw an opportunity with the recent flare-up to establish itself as the preeminent voice on behalf of the Palestinians against Israel. And so they too have benefited. Whether it's a symbiotic relationship to the extent that Friedman talks about, well, he's a lot smarter on these topics than I am, but it's pretty clear to his core point that both Hamas and Netanyahu have benefited politically from the violence.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience again for all of your great questions. I know, again, these hours always fly by. So we'll focus on China next week, voting reforms, and then you guys get that survey after the webinar so you can tell us maybe what our third topic should be.
Perfect.
So we'll check. We read all of those. We do check the answers. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. That was such an informative discussion. You help us to navigate through all of these very complex issues. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Kim. As always, I really enjoyed it, and I hope our group did too.
We're looking forward to next Tuesday. It's already loaded up, given the breaking news that may happen between now and then.
One thing is clear, we will have more than enough to talk about.
We always do. For our viewers, please keep these very unique important discussions going with your help. There's an easy way to do it. Just text the name Schnur to the chat on your control panel. We really need your help to support these programs. There aren't very many nonpartisan civil discussions with so much good factual information. So please help keep us going. We have a terrific lineup next week. In addition to Dan's program on Tuesday, tomorrow, as Jessica mentioned, we have a conversation with the Ambassador of France to the United States, Philippe Etienne. On Thursday, we have a partnered program with Writer's Block. This is a conversation with Elizabeth Hinton on America on Fire, the untold history of police violence and Black rebellion since the 1960s. Upcoming programs also include the role of art and artists in Middle Eastern diplomacy, Latin America's changing international role, creating opportunity from crisis, learning from the global consequences of COVID, which is one of our several high school programs for high school students. And of course, a very special program on June 2nd, Notre Dame de Paris, Restoring a Gothic Masterpiece. So please go to our website, register for programs, check out our past programs, please become a member, make a donation, and everybody stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Dan, thank you so much. See you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Kim. See you next week.